One day I stumbled across this YouTube video by Benita. It was one of his breadboard project videos, and I found I understood it. I looked up the datasheet for one of the chips he was using and found I could understand that mostly also. Then I looked at the price for a breadboard and a few chips and found that they were cheap. Next thing I know, I've got a new hobby. My project is not a Benita project, but Ben's videos include useful breadboarding tips, clear explanation of parts and of circuits, and how computers work. There's lots of good information, good ideas, and good starting points here. This beautiful mess is my project, and contrary to Benita's suggestions, there are a lot of long and looping connections. I cannot recommend this as a good way to do it. I'm using DuPont connectors, which you can see at the end of the rainbow strips of wire, because they work out cheaper than the American wire gauge 22 single core wire recommended by Benita. If you must use DuPont connectors, be sure to buy a set of crimping shells like these. It's very easy to buy pre-crimped DuPont connectors like this, in big bundles like this. You can get them in 10 or 20 or 30 centimeter lengths, and male to male or male to female or female to female, whatever your need is. Trouble is, if you start trying to connect multiple single ends into a breadboard, one, it's time consuming, and two, it becomes unreliable. It's much better to buy a set of plastic housings like these, because I don't know if you can see properly on the video here, these single ends, and I realise the camera isn't focusing properly here, but bear with me guys. These plastic end shells can be removed very easily with a pair of tweezers or any sharp pointed tool really. And then you put on a new plastic shell, and you can build up a connector which is 2, 4, 5, even 8 wide, and with multiple wires in a single shell like this, you can insert and remove a bunch of wires in one single go. Much easier and much more reliable than doing it with 5 separate DuPont wires. Another point is to be aware of cheap breadboards. I have consistently failed to buy Benita's recommendation of BB830 breadboards, and I always wind up buying cheaper boards. The issue is that over time these boards lose their grip on connections, and even though in this case vertically it appears to have some grip, yeah, you can see that the connector wiggles from side to side very easily, and additionally you can see I've had a short circuit on this board. For me, symptoms of loose connections can show up with inconsistent results when I run a program or data being corrupted along the data bus. Either follow Benita's breadboard recommendations for quality breadboard, or be prepared to refresh breadboards with new ones when you find connections are becoming unreliable. This breadboard here is well overdue for retirement. I pulled it out of my project and replaced it with a similar sized one, and that resolved some issue I was having at that time. Beware of China chips. These here are some OPL2 chips which I ordered off eBay, and in fact I ordered 3 of them and only 2 ever arrived, and I could never get these 2 chips to work. Now, I admit that might be misunderstanding how to use them, but I've seen YouTubers such as Noel's Retro Lab, Adrian's Digital Basement, and LGR have some success with China chips, but I haven't. Beware, I always prefer to source my chips locally. By locally, I mean here in New Zealand. Which leads me to my next point, which is compromise. Retro chips like this are hard to come by within the country, and given I haven't had success with eBay, I need to make do with what I can find. For example, here I have found a Philips SAA1099 digital sound generator chip. It is 8-bit compatible, it is tri-state compatible, and meets my needs for what I want to do with my project very neatly. Here I have it set up, linked up to a microcontroller. There's a Instructables project you can set up to do the exact same thing, or if I remember, I'll put a link in the description. And yeah, I'm quite happy to use this instead of APL2. Another thing I can't find in New Zealand is standard clock oscillators. The only one I found didn't have a datasheet to go along with it, and that's no good. But crystals are available, and standard logic chips are easily available. And so here alongside my retro sound chip, I have a Pierce oscillator. I find Pierce oscillators to be a suitable substitute for standard clock oscillators, given that I can get these parts locally. This is not what soldering should look like, and this is not a good soldering iron to use. Although it is, a breadboard project that I'm working on, occasionally I do need to solder things like a power cable or a connector or the back of the LCD screen, and this is not the way to do it. I cannot recommend anything particular since this is the only soldering iron I've ever had. I suggest you go look for something that works better than this. Make use of microcontrollers. Microcontrollers are not at all in the retro theme, but they are super convenient. The Arduino Nano is a really cheap device. It's really easy to program. It works at 5-volt level like a lot of the retro chips that I'm interested in, and fits right on a breadboard. It is a limited device, but the convenience and cost make it a must-have for me. I've used this to test parts of the project separately, make sure they're working before I hook it up to the rest of it. And I'm using one in the middle of my bird's nest as a ROM emulator. I can get some codes onto my project very easily. Also works as an on-the-fly disassembler. The Raspberry Pi Pico here, this is a much more powerful microcontroller. It runs at 133 megahertz instead of the Arduino's 16 megahertz. It's dual core. But the main problem with this for me is that it runs at 3.3 volt levels. If I accidentally send a 5 or 4 volt signal into this, it will blow the whole device. And yeah, that seems like something that I would likely do. So yeah, Nanos, very useful. I'm using an ATX power supply for my project. I found that a USB cable could not supply enough current. However, there are some disadvantages to using an ATX power supply. One of the main problems with an ATX power supply is that it's not current limited. If I accidentally create a short circuit, it will just deliver the current and burn out wires and plastic boards. This connector here is a power connector which has melted for exactly that reason. I plugged it into the negative rail by accident, and yeah, I got smoke and melted parts. This one will need replacing. And the other issue with an ATX power supply is that the power supply isn't stable until about half a second after it is turned on. This means that if you have counter chips like an LS93 or anything else which reacts to varying signals, it will be triggered by the power supply until it is stable. Now, I have overcome this by connecting the powered goods signal to the reset circuit of my project, and the CPU stays reset until the power supply is stabilized. I realize there are many other power supply solutions for a project such as this. Once again, I'm unable to recommend anything in particular. However, be aware of the cons of an ATX power supply if you should choose to go down this path. Keep a schematic of your project. This is obviously not the schematic of my project. I haven't decided whether I want to open source it yet or not. This is just one of the example schematics that comes as Fritzing, which is the software that I'm using. Fritzing is a free open source piece of software, and it's available for Linux, Mac, and Windows. It has some limitations, so feel free to explore other options if you choose. And I find schematics very useful to help me understand what's going on, or if I need to backtrack, like I keep multiple copies in case I need to backtrack, and if I'm coming back to my project after a break, it really helps me understand where I left off. Be prepared to learn C language and assembly language. C or possibly another language may be necessary for any microcontrollers you use in or alongside your project. I've used C on and off on a hobby basis over the last 20 years. I don't find that to be a problem. There are many examples for Arduino and other common microcontroller products, and yeah, again, this is not my code. This is one of the examples that comes with the Arduino toolkit. And be prepared to learn assembly language. I have here an excellent page about the jump command in Z80 assembly language. I definitely find assembly language to be far more challenging than something like C or Python, but it is entirely necessary because CPUs only understand machine language, and machine language is only derived from assembly language. Find an assembler for your CPU that is actively maintained, search for examples, read the documentation for the CPU that you use, and start with some very simple assembly code, even if it is quite abstract. And that leads me to my next point, which is I found I needed to create an emulator. The emulator I have made is very crude, but it allows me to step through one instruction at a time, see what ports and memories are being written to, and examine the values of the CPU's registers and flags. This enables me to do debugging and find problems with my code before I put it on my project. And be aware of the costs. I have lost track of how much I have spent on my project. It is very easy to make a little start for $20 or something like that with a breadboard and a few components and some wire, but even cheap parts add up. There have been plenty of dead ends on the project and things like that didn't work out. I made mistakes that have just destroyed chips and wires and needed to replace breadboards. If you don't have them already, allow money for tools like wire strippers and cutters and fine pliers and tweezers, and a multimeter, and for containers and for spare parts. Basically, my approach is if I'm working on this project, I need to set aside a weekly budget and stick to it. Last but not least, take a break from your project once in a while. I often get stuck with things I don't know how to proceed. I find taking a break, whether it is 2 hours or 2 months, I can come back with fresh ideas and enthusiasm. And if you've watched this far, very well done. If there is interest in this video, I may do another explaining my project. Thank you.